On this second part of my interview with Waddie Mitchell, Waddie shares some thoughts about literature, and it reminded me of a quote by the great cowboy artist Charlie Russell. Russell said, "The West is dead, my friend, but writers hold the seed, and what they sow will live and grow again to those who read." Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. Each episode I'll interview a different guest and ask them to share stories, discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is cowboy poet Waddie Mitchell. Unlike a lot of us who came to music and poetry through recordings and books, Waddie came to the poetry through the oral tradition on the ranches he grew up on and worked on. In this second part of my conversation with Waddie, I asked him to tell me about his first exposure to poetry. Here's Waddie Mitchell.
In that school we went to, it was one school marm for eight grades, often though we didn't have all 8 grades there. And if you had 2 in your class or you're the only one, the teacher had to spend a little bit of time with you every day. Maybe, catch you up on your math and tell you what you're supposed to read for history and give you a little test, these things. But then the afternoon, what can you do with a room full of kids that they all might enjoy? And she read to us. And she read to us, the Little House on the Prairie series. She read to us the Bear Country series. But every once in a while, she'd read us a poem. Casey at the Bat, The Raven, and my favorite, The Cremation of Sam McGee. And when I heard that, when you don't have TV, kids, if you're going to teach them something, Dr. Seuss, look at that. All kids love Dr. Seuss because of the music of the language. Before I ever left home, when I was about 9, I got to go sleep in the bunkhouse with the cowboys if I kept my mouth shut. And I wash my feet now and then. But those guys at night would be talking. I remember one night I'm laying in bed, and pretty much everybody else is. And this we used him as a wrangler. He told us he had been a cowboy, but we don't think so. But he made a wrangler after about a month of getting with it. He got the idea. And he started just spewing out a poem. And it was a Bruce Cascadden poem called When They Finish Shipping Cattle in the Fall. And he recited it, not well, very sing-songy, but that was fine to my ear and everybody else's, because we were all just amazed this guy could remember so damn many words. But as I listened, when it was getting just a little bit sad, I started tearing up. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to get kicked out of here. These guys are going to see me crying. And I kind of peeked around to see if anybody was looking. And everybody else was kind of tearing up. And it was one of those deals when he finished the poem, there wasn't another word spoke that night. And that's when I said to myself, I love that. I want to do that. I want to learn that poem. So I stayed after him for a long time, wanting him to give me that poem. And he says, okay, you sit down and I'll tell it to you, and you write it down. Well, I was a pretty slow writer, and he'd get through one little line, and I'd have to back him up again, and then back him up again, and he got frustrated, and I never did get that poem from him. But I found other young guys that liked it. We'd trade poems, what few I knew. We'd trade poems back and forth. Ross Knox and I did that. Randy Stoll and I did that. Oh, well, there's actually quite a few of them that we traded poems. And sometimes they were cowboy poems and sometimes they weren't. Sometimes it was Robert Frost. Often it was Robert Service. Robert Service was, I think, recited around more campfires that I'd sat at than any of the cowboy poets. And what I learned is that those fellers that could tell a poem and not sing-song it were a lot more interesting to listen to. So that's when I just started trying to just tell the story. Tell the story, let the words find their way in the listener's ear secretly. It was there, but oftentimes they didn't realize it was there, but still would tell you that they were enchanted just by the story. Nobody, especially me, ever thought we'd have reason to get up. The only place we recited these was trotting along horseback behind the barn, maybe in a pickup spreading salt. We didn't, there's no place to recite this poetry, and nobody that was very much interested in it. A couple times we tried doing it in a bar just together with just the cowboys around. Some big old miner would say, "Shut up over there, you're making me sick." But yeah, it came, and how that happened is Sarah Sweetwater, wonderful lady who just died last year, she was kind of Elko's Miss Art, and if there was somebody artistic or something artistic happening, she was always there. She had Larry Schutte and I come to a little kind of a county park arts deal. And the local painters and the local sculptures and a local knife maker and a local bent cedar wood chair maker and a few of those kind of people were there. And she had us there teaching people how to braid rawhide and twist horsehair. They had a tent just around the corner there that they'd set up, and they'd got a bunch of the old-time cowboys that had quite a reputation. Of course, in our country, they're buckaroos. And they would be sitting there, and, the whole idea was to get them to tell stories. They would be asked a question by a folklorist. Did you enjoy back in the 30s, did you enjoy that more than up into the 50s? And the answer they'd get is, yeah. And so she come running out and she said, "Waddie, would you please come down here and give some of your poetry?" And that's the first time in my life I had been asked to do it publicly. And there was a big old folklorist there, and he come up to me afterwards with this gentle demeanor and said, "Hi, my name's Hal Cannon. I'm a folklorist from Salt Lake City. Do any other cowboys do this, recite poetry?" And I said, "Yeah, a bunch of them that I know do." And he kind of had a funny look on his face, and he says, "Is there any way to get a hold of you?" Well, I was at the 2U Ranch then and had a camp with a phone right in the house. So I give him that number, and in about a week he called up and he says, "We've gotten a lot of interest in maybe showing the world, because it seems so strange to us." You know, all of us love cowboys, all of our generation. We grew up with, Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and John Wayne, and we grew up with cowboy heroes. But we never pictured one of those. Well, imagine John Wayne sitting around a campfire spewing poetry. It just didn't seem right to them. So I asked a bunch of my friends that did it, and Hal started getting other folklorists around different states and said, would you go out and try to find a cowboy poet in your part of the country? Well, they did a good job. They found quite a few. That first morning, we were setting up chairs. A gal named Sid McMullen, and she'd been on the board. So many of these people weren't cowboys that helped get this stuff started. They were just people interested in the arts. And we'd set up about 100 chairs. And I looked there and said, who the heck are we kidding? Who's going to come in the middle of the winter to hear a bunch of cowboys spew poetic? And I think we shouldn't put any more chairs up because we don't want it to look so spread out. So we quit, and I think it was about 11 o'clock that morning we opened the doors, and within an hour there's 2,000 people in there. Of course, we started setting up more chairs, and we didn't know how to put this on. They'd get us up behind a mic. We didn't know how to talk into a mic, and they'd want us to recite this poetry, and so many of the guys are shaking so bad you could actually hear the floor, kind of creak under them. But the audience thought, I like this. The audience said, why have we never heard this? And there were great old cowboys and a bunch of us young fellers in our late 30s to mid 40s. And now we're all, of course, 32 years later, the old guys. I don't know why it works so hard and why it works so well. But I've had people in the last 30-some years come up to me and said, this has changed my life. And we're not talking ranchers. We're talking firefighters. We're talking preachers. We're talking newspaper executives. We're talking just Americans. Now, it's not for everybody, but a lot of Americans. I had guys come up and say, I didn't know I was looking for anything. But when I found this, I realized I was looking for this my whole life. Literature itself is the best thing man has. It's the best way to travel if you don't get to travel. It's the best way to fall in love if you can't find a love. It's the best way to have high adventure if you've got a semi-dull life. But more than all, it's a way to find out who you are and what your philosophy is. And so I think that a lot of those people that came up and said, I didn't know I was looking for this, but I've now realized was probably the work ethic, the honesty, the humor that 9/10 of the time is self-deprecating over making fun of somebody. And letting people know that nature is as good as they wished it would be, but a hell of a lot harsher.
The first cowboy poetry gathering in Elko, Nevada was such a success that it became an annual event that began to draw thousands of attendees every year. The Elko Gathering started a renaissance celebrating the traditions of cowboy culture that is now in its 33rd year. The gathering also launched the careers of several cowboy poets and musicians who became full-time performers, including Waddie Mitchell.
Well, a lot of writers in magazines and papers had gotten a memo on their desk saying, we're sending you to Elko, Nevada. There's cowboys out there that are going to be reading poetry all weekend long. And they'd come out and they'd think they were going to fill a 3-inch narrow column. You know, I asked one guy, I said, what did you think with that happening? He says, well, to be honest with you, last year they sent me to the National Cow Chip Throwing Contest. I said, well, you're getting pretty close to that right here. But they come out, and all of a sudden, that 3-inch little column turns out to 3 pages. We touched them. They were writers. That's how they're making their living. And they watched literature being spoken other than being read. And next thing I know, I can't put a damn cow through a gate because there's somebody with a camera wanting to capture the romance of my life, and they're just making it harder. But I guess it was Newsweek or People, one of those magazines that somebody from the Johnny Carson show saw. And I was out on the bar at the time, and we were camped at the Tokambambi, quite a few, 40 miles of dirt road, then 100 miles to town. So they got a hold of my neighbor, which was the closest phone. And somehow somebody told them to call that, and they were at the end of that 44 miles of dirt road. They called and wanted to talk to Waddie Mitchell, and the guy says, well, he says, this is the neighbor's ranch, but we'd be glad to, if it's important, glad to take him the message. Well, I'm sure these people that are calling are think you're going to walk across the street and give this fella a message. But they drove that 44 miles dirt road. Of course, I was out of horseback, and when we finally come trotting in, they'd already had pie and iced tea, and they told us that had to pull out a paper to read his name. They didn't have a TV either and know who he was. And they said, a feller named Johnny Carson wants you to come on his show. And I said, well, who the hell's Johnny Carson? And he says, he got a TV show, I guess. And I said, well, what does he want? And I think they want you to do some poetry. I said, well, I got some cattle to ship. Thank you. Just thank them, and I'll have to pass on this. And so they drove home, and they got another phone call from these people. And they said, I want you to call around to some neighbors that's got a TV, and maybe they'll tell you. So he did, and he drove all the way back there and said, I guess this is a pretty big deal. I said, how much is this going to cost me? They said, oh, no, they said it wasn't going to cost you nothing. They'd pay the whole deal. So I'd done a little airplane flying because I'd been in the service, but I'd never really just flew to go somewhere that wasn't to war. So I got in that airplane. I get down Los Angeles. There's a fella all dressed up in a suit like he's in the military kind of, but ends up to be a driver. He's got a big sign says Waddie Mitchell on it, and I went up to him and said, I'll be darned, that's my name too. He says, well, do you have bags, sir? And I said, yeah. So we went over to the bag stand, and here comes a bag. And I go to reach for it, and he says, please, sir. And he grabs it and puts it there. And I said, well, I got one more. And I go to grab for it, and please, sir. And I said, well, there's 2 bags. Let me carry one. He says, he kind of just nods his head towards the door. So I got, now, there's a fellow behind you. He's got 2 suitcases in his hands. This is one of them doors you open. It doesn't just slide. So what do? Well, I jumped ahead and opened the door for him. And he kind of rolled his eyes and said, please, sir. So I stepped back in. he opens the door. I go through it, then he has to hold the door open and grab them 2 bags. Then he puts them down on the floor there, or sidewalk outside, and he says, I'll be right back with the car. So I'm looking at all these people that are gawking at me because I'm dressed a little different than them in Los Angeles, and I was feeling pretty out of place when this long old limousine drives up right in front of me, and I think, oh, now I'm right in the way. So I pick my 2 suitcases up, walk away, and the driver gets out and calls me back. I ride in the suitcases. I'm getting in the car. Everybody's looking at me because they're, they thought just a dumb guy there standing at first. Then they see this limousine come. And so as I get in the deal, I kind of give them a salute, get in the car and go. We get there, and I'd never been on TV or a thing. They give me my own room, and they had a little sink in there. And it was a pretty shallow little sink, and it had quite a bit of water pressure. And I thought, I'm just going to kind of slap some water in my eyes, And I turned that thing on, and whoosh, like that, and it just covered the front of my britches. I looked like I had peed my pants. There was no towels in there. I didn't have any change of clothes. But they had one of those hand dryers where you push the little button and the air comes out. So I get kneeling up on top of that counter, and I turn that thing on. I'm trying to dry myself off when 2 of them little secretaries walked in the room. Told me it was about time. So that was no big deal going out there because, they had the cameras right there. You couldn't see the crowd, and Johnny Carson, just a nice feller. So we had a nice little visit, and he really liked it, so he invited us back the next year. And that 3rd year, I got to go with Baxter Black. Now, if anybody in America doesn't know who Baxter Black is, he is the modern equivalent of Mark Twain. He is not only brilliant, but he's got a mind that as straight as it can think. It can get crooked as hell too, and he can make me laugh for hours. He really can. So we get on there, and if you remember his poem, The Vegetarian's Nightmare, I thought Johnny Carson was going to fall off his damn seat. He was just having a ball. And all of a sudden, the term cowboy poetry wasn't as near an oxymoron as it had been. It being an oxymoron is what drew the first people out to write about it. But it was finding its way to mainstream in a hurry. And I think that's why we're on the 33rd year in Elko. The world turns around, and as that world turns around, it changes. And if it turns around enough, it changes to where what we knew is no longer. Cowboys, when we started this thing, I told people, I said, I don't know if we're going to be around 10 years or not. But I hope some of this writing does so we can remember it. But since then, like any artist community, you get saddle makers. You get 3 saddle makers in a town. It rises all of their art form. It's good for it. You get painters in a colony, and all of their art becomes better. you get a cluster of cowboy poets together. And over the years, that art has raised. Early days, there was almost 80-90% recitation of the greats. You know, the Bruce Gaddens, the Badger Clarks, all the guys that came before us. And slowly, we started seeing more and more personal poetry. We started seeing people that had written for years and years and put it in the kitchen drawer, pull them out and work them over, try to get into Elko. And somehow that legitimizes what they thought was almost strange. They were the only people they knew that felt compelled, that felt a need to sit down and write this stuff out. And these gatherings kind of put us all together. And I can't tell you how poetry has risen, and songwriting. And it's come, yes, the 1860s were the height of it all. But that doesn't mean the 1950s were not also cool. And it sure doesn't mean that 2016, it's not over yet. It's not done. The words we use, the situations we use, the guys that try to all make it sound like 1860 can't get her done. But the guys that are writing what they know in their own tune are the guys that are going to let future generations know what 2016 was like. And we need more young guys. We need to somehow entice those inclined to give it a try. Because I want to know what 2030 is going to be like.
In the early 1990s, under the leadership of Michael Martin Murphey, several cowboy performers, including Don Edwards, Red Steagall, the Sons of the San Joaquin, and Waddie Mitchell, signed on to the newly formed Warner Western label, a record label division of Warner Brothers that was totally devoted to cowboy music and poetry. This brought cowboy poetry and music to a much broader audience and allowed many people, like myself, to discover Waddie's poetry for the first time.
You mentioned Michael Martin Murphey. I don't know if he hasn't done as much for this genre as anybody else. He already had the name, and he had the vision, and he's a smart businessman, and he started things like Westfest in Copper Mountain, Colorado, where 40,000 people would come over a weekend. That gives you a lot of exposure. When you're riding with talent like Don Edwards, who can make any song sound great, but his voice can just flow over you like warm maple syrup. It's just so wonderful. People said, "What the heck is going on?" Murphy would write these songs that would be so entertaining. He's so talented. He can, play any instrument. He'd bring a big band, and all of a sudden, that was cool. Then they'd send this lone poet out there, and I'd try to say, and those people, they said, if this music is this good, let's listen to this. And a whole hillside of people would quiet down. And I was afraid to do anything but comedy. But they kept saying, yes, go ahead, give it to us. And so you could give them some pretty intelligent poetry. And when there's a silence for 2 beats before they start clapping, you know they've heard it. You know they're coming down from it, and then appreciation. So much of everything good that happened in this is a big part of Michael Martin Murphey. And he also went to Jim Ed Norman, who was the head of Warner Brothers in Nashville at the time, and said, hey, I want you to listen to my friends. I want you to see what's going on out west. And they actually allowed us to start the Warner Western label. And we had great artists on it. And we've got a picture of us in New York City, standing by a big record store with one big window completely covered with Don and I. And we thought, holy mackerel, who'd ever thunk? The recording deal was totally foreign to me, totally foreign. So I just took orders, you know. They'd figure out the music bed and then want me to recite over the music bed. And I did, and we had, just because it was new and different, we had some nice things said about it. And Don pretty much put up with the first record. But by the time second record came, and guys come in with big violas and racks of keyboards and 4 sets of drums, well, the producer had gotten all these studio musicians to come in with their deal. And I remember I'm sitting there all ready to listen to this wonderful stuff, and Don says, get them guys out of here. Get them out. Go ahead. I don't want rack man here. I don't need all these drums. Get them out. And I thought, well, there goes our career. But they got out, and what Don made didn't get anybody mad at him. Even the producer that had all these visions. It was Don Edwards and Red Steagall and Michael Martin Murphey who brought the cowboy thing to the world. And it gave Buck Ramsey, it probably gave Buck Ramsey 10 more years. What a talent. It started getting people saying, well, if this is good, what happened to the old stuff? Like you, for the instance. And so we've got people that are going to keep the old stuff for us, and in a few years, what I've been doing is going to be old stuff. But if there's not interest in it, then it dies. It did change my life. Of course, by then I'd had a bad back and been bucked off enough that it was getting hard to get around and ride the kind of horses I wanted to ride. And all of a sudden, I'm not a cowboy, spent all my life cowboying, never made any money, and all of a sudden I'm out there just talking about it and making money. It just didn't make sense to me, but it's been good to me.
Thanks for doing this, Waddie. Thanks for sharing your stories with me.
It's been more than my pleasure, and, you know, I'd visit any place, anytime with you.
All right, folks, that's it for this episode. Thank you to Waddie Mitchell for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Waddie at waddiemitchell.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com/cowboycrossroads. If you'd like to help me keep this show going, you can make a donation on the website. It would also help me if you'd take the time to rate the show on iTunes and leave a review. Be sure and subscribe while you're there, and as soon as I post a new episode, it'll pop up on your phone. If you'd like to send me a message or a question, please email andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.